Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bruce Shire. I'm on the ESA Board of Directors and a very important ephemera collector. But unfortunately for me, there's someone here who is more important, and this is Dave Mihaly. And Dave Mihaly is what I call a triple threat. He is a passionate and astute collector, an academically trained and demonstrably experienced scholar, and a curator of some of the most important ephemera collections in the world. So you can see how disappointed I am. Dave has formed remarkable collections, including one of the largest collections of graphic celluloid advertising. He received some of his scholarly training at the Cooperstown Graduate Program, where he acquired a master's degree in history and museum studies. He is currently the J.T. Last Curator of Graphic Arts and Social History at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. That's a big deal. The portion of the Huntington which Dave supervises houses important collections from several Rickards Medal Award winners, including Nancy Rosen's Valentine's collection. Shout out to Nancy, who's here. The Joseph Rodriguez Cameo collection. Jose Rodriguez Cameo collection. An early ephemera Al Malpa collection, the letterhead collection of Jonathan Bulkley, and the phenomenal J. Last collection. Dave is responsible for the Huntington's 1 million posters, prints, and other ephemera. For the Huntington, Dave has curated 2 exhibitions, the seminal The Color Explosion, 19th Century American Lithography from the J. Last T collection, and Your Country Calls, Posters of the First World War. The Color Explosion featured more than 250 objects, including advertising posters, art prints, calendars, children's books, product labels, sales catalogs, sheet music, toys, and trade cards. An antique lithographic press was also on display. A tremendously large banner advertising the exhibit encompassed the face of the Huntington Library, and another was elevated above a street. Before the exhibition, the J.T. Last collection was said to have about 135,000 objects in all and had never been seen by the public. I believe that estimate is probably low. Maybe Dave can enlighten us on that. Dave has developed more than 30 major exhibitions for clients, including the Amnon Center Museum of American Art, Art Center College of Design, Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, Chrysler Museum of Glass, Johns Hopkins University, the National Park Service in Pennsylvania, Revolutionary Spaces in Boston, the Smithsonian, and the Walters Art Gallery. He regularly presents on diverse topics of popular culture, ranging from American advertising, Valentine ephemera, and political propaganda to California surf culture and psychedelia, which I guess is the last topic he's going to treat us to today. I am now pleased to give you Dave Mihaly, an ephemerist extraordinaire.
Lunch. How's the volume? Good? Too low. Lunch is a tough act to follow. So thanks for coming back. Bruce, thank you so much for that super generous introduction. I also want to thank the conference committee for allowing me to lower the academic standards here by presenting on hippies, drugs, and rock and roll. And also a big thank you to all of you. Your support allows us as presenters to do what we love to do, which is share our collections, contextualize them, and maybe even put together an effective PowerPoint. So hopefully this PowerPoint will not be powerless and not be pointless. So we have a lot to unpack in 30 minutes. I'm going to just start very quickly with recent history of psychedelics in the news and go back into a little deeper dive into history, but especially focusing on the history of psychedelics in California in the 50s and 60s, all leading up to 3 major donations which form the archive of our psychedelic collection. And then we'll actually get into the psychedelic art itself and look at the innovations in concerts, the innovative promoters, and also the incredibly innovative artists. As time permits, I hope I can share with you some of my favorite finds, which are not concert posters, and then try to wrap up and explain why the Huntington and why I am building this collection. What's the importance of it? So recent positive news about psychedelics you may have read about is treating mental health issues, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and also enhancing creativity and originality if controlled. And that's the big one, because the tragic news has to do with when it's not controlled, either medically or for recreational use, as in the case with Matthew Perry. And I have to say, I never expected Matthew Perry to enter one of my PowerPoints, but recent scholarship includes these 2 great reads. The first by Ernesto Londoño, Trippy, where he writes about psychedelics and mental health today, and another by Benjamin Breen, Tripping on Utopia, and he talks about the early history of psychedelic utopian research. So psychoactive drugs have been around for centuries. Archaeologists believe cave art was influenced by psychoactive drugs, and scholars of ancient history have confirmed that ritual ceremonies by indigenous peoples of the Americas and non-Western cultures use psychoactive drugs. These were organic drugs for the time. And this depiction on the Greek vase is of a psychedelic potion that is being exchanged. But when we think of psychedelic history in the 20th century, there are some key dates to just keep in mind. 1937, LSD is synthesized by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann. 6 years later, 1943, Hofmann accidentally discovers hallucinogenic effects of LSD. More on that in a moment. And in the 1950s, British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond pioneers research involving LSD and mescaline to treat mental illness, alcohol depression, and to enhance creativity. Osmond coins the term psychedelic in 1957, combining 2 Greek terms, psyche for the mind and delos for awaken. By 1962, Beverly Hills psychiatrist Sidney Cohen gives the medical community its first warning: LSD is dangerous. And more on him in a moment. And then by 66, Nevada and California declare LSD illegal, and other states soon follow. But also in 1966, we see the first use of the term related to music, and it's for an album called The Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators. So here's a later picture of Albert Hofmann. While preparing an LSD compound, he accidentally absorbs a tiny bit through the fingertips and proceeded on a 3-hour perceptual experience. And he vividly describes it. I was seized by a peculiar restlessness associated with a mild sensation of dizziness. I lay down and sunk into a kind of drunkenness which was not unpleasant, and which was characterized by extreme activity of the imagination. There surged upon me an uninterrupted stream of fantastic images of extraordinary plasticity and vividness, accompanied by an intense kaleidoscopic-like play of colors. Clearly, Hofmann had a really good trip the first time. Los Angeles in the 1950s was a hotbed for LSD research, led by pioneering psychiatrists Sidney Cohen, Oscar Janiger, and Humphrey Osmond. They held these maverick LSD sessions in Beverly Hills for $100 a pop. It's about $1,000 today. And part of their research was to try to link LSD and discover LSD's creativity and ability to access crazy consciousness without losing control. But take a look at their client list in the lower left. They turned on Hollywood celebrities and literary giants, including James Coburn, Cary Grant, Aldous Huxley, Christopher Isherwood, Claire Booth Luce, Rita Moreno, Jack Nicholson, why doesn't that surprise me? Anais Nin and Andre Previn, to name just a few. San Francisco in the 1950s had the Beat Generation, where New York City writers arrive in the city to energize the local art scene. It's a bohemian subculture based in North Beach. And part of their philosophy was to reject literary formalism and reject American culture based on materialism and capitalism. So California in the 1960s, the next decade, is primed for the psychedelic movement. It's marked by dramatic social, artistic, and musical change. And it's defined by expressive, non-conforming lifestyles, intense experiences, Eastern mysticism, and the liberating power of nature. And it's fueled by psychedelic drugs with the intention to attain a better understanding of yourself, of the world, and in essence, better living through chemistry. Drug use was sparked by acid tests. And acid tests were LSD parties held by author Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters. And these acid tests involved light shows, fluorescent paint, freestyle dancing, and music by Kesey's house band, Grateful Dead. What Kesey didn't really know was that he was creating rock concerts that inspired what would become rituals of American youth culture. And he created this handbill, which was an open invitation to anybody to attend his acid tests. And his cocktail of choice was an acid tablet dropped into orange juice or Kool-Aid, which incidentally is going to be the signature cocktail at tomorrow night's banquet dinner. So sign up now. So the timing was perfect, in essence, for the psychedelic era to come to California. It was an organic evolution from the Beat Generation, but more importantly, half of the US population was under the age of 25 in the 1960s. That's staggering. And so it created a youth movement to California, where the population surges by 25% in the decade. And part of what fuels that youth movement is California is offering higher education virtually for free. But then there's also this craziness that's happening that fuels an awareness and a counterculture lifestyle. Protests about the Vietnam War, the draft, nuclear destruction, students' rights. In essence, it was the perfect storm. Haight-Ashbury was the heart and soul of San Francisco's counterculture. It's what North Beach was to the Beats. And the Haight was once an affluent neighborhood of large Victorian homes that got divided into flats due to housing shortage after World War II. These flats became a source for low-cost rentals, especially to students at San Francisco State. And it was an easy access to Golden Gate Park, so you could commune with nature. The first collection that I received and accepted was donated in 2010, Tony Newhall. And Tony came to me and donated 62 rock concert posters that he acquired while he was a graduate student at Stanford. from 66 to 67. So he was there, and he acquired these by attending the concerts, and also he interviewed Bill Graham for one of his master's projects. But what Tony didn't realize when he donated this collection was that he had the first 62 posters in a number series of 287 that Bill Graham created. And almost all of them were by Wes Wilson, who was the pioneer of the poster, of the psychedelic poster, and we'll talk more about him. So 2 years later, I wrote an article about Tony's collection for our members magazine, Huntington Frontiers. Are you visually experienced? What rock concert posters have in common with 19th and 20th century graphic art. And I just lucked out because a psychedelic poster was put on the cover. Now, it turned heads at the Huntington, but it also brought some pretty neat gifts. A member saw the article and sent me this. And this is an iconic handbill from the powwow gathering of tribes in San Francisco. It is the event that starts the Summer of Love. And she writes this very moving article, Amy Rule. This is a talisman from those days, a swirling mixture of cultures, calligraphy, and coolness in the artwork that stood for our revolutionary hopes and dreams. It is also a reminder that I did live through this period and became who I am because of it. And then a dealer reached out, saw the article, and said, you might be interested in this. Jack Morrison ran for mayor in 1967, targeting young San Francisco voters with this campaign poster. It equaled his liberal views and working class appeal with the vibrant energy and counterculture values inherent in psychedelic art. But I have to wonder, is this the most unlikely person on a psychedelic poster? And don't miss the flaming green dollar sign behind Jack Morris. The next collection that came was from Valerie and Craig Pearson, and they donated this in 2016. And they acquired it. Craig Pearson actually answered an ad in 1969 in the back of Rolling Stone magazine to buy all 98 rock concert posters done by Family Dog Productions. Now, you might recognize the iconic image of the Grateful Dead, Skull and Roses. It was actually lifted from a classic work of literature. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And supposedly the artists, Alton Kelly and Stanley Mouse, went to their local library and discovered this and happened to be looking through and saw that image to what became that poster. It's almost a direct ripoff. Almost, except for the lettering, the coloring, that you can copyright and control. And the third collection that arrived came from Jay Last in 2018. And Jay handed me a box of 198 rock concert postcards and handbills. Up to then, everything else was posters, so I was excited to get this. It included contents of a memory album by a Sacramento woman who actually went to these concerts, received flyers in the mail, and documented some of the experiences she had. So rock concerts actually began as dance and benefit concerts in 1965. And they were held in Golden Gate Park, at the Fillmore Auditorium, and Avalon Ballroom to start. And if you look closely at the bottom of this poster, Bill Graham actually describes this as a dance concert, not a music concert. Their elements included music, light shows, freestyle dancing. They were participatory, they were open-ended, they were very transcendent. One song could last 25 minutes. This was pretty revolutionary for the time for concerts. And those who attended, I'm told, considered these things as community events where they could go into a crowd and know that they were going to see and meet 100 to 200 of their friends. As a concert counterpoint, the Beatles were in San Francisco in the summer of 1966. And this is the poster that their manager, Brian Epstein, selected. It's done by the same leading psychedelic poster artist, but it's much more conservative. And the Beatles wore matching suits, and they played 7 songs in 25 minutes. So the total opposite experience was happening across town. Now, the real innovators behind the posters are the promoters, and 2 of the biggest were Bill Graham and Chet Helms. Bill organized concerts at the Fillmore Auditorium under the name Bill Graham Presents, and he's considered the first to hire the poster artists. Chet Helms organized concerts at both the Fillmore and Avalon Ballroom, operating under the name Family Dog Productions, and he is considered to be the first to create concerts with psychedelic light shows. Oops. When they were first creating advertising for their concerts, they started with handbills and then morphed into posters and postcards. And they installed these in stores and head shops, on telephone poles, on buildings around campuses. And that's when Bill realized that he saw people taking this artwork as soon as he posted it. And he said, enough of this. I'm not getting the advertising that I needed. So he decided to create this incentive program that will give you a free poster with an advance ticket purchase or as you come through the doors at the concert. He also got somewhat creative with the postcards that he created. They were used as direct mailers, as seen here, but then also he started to include handout calendars on the backs, and he could pass those out as well. And they even got creative in terms of creating 2 different posters as a matching set at two different venues. And the idea is you bring them together and you have one larger image. Or they would create a matching set for not just for the same venue, but 2 different artists and 2 different dates intended to come together as a larger image. So it's the posters themselves that really started to flip the rules of graphic design. Simple and readable, yielded to complex and illegible. They were marked by intense colors, revolving patterns, distorted visuals, vibrating typography. All of this was intended to evoke a psychedelic experience. And it went on to influence other graphic art, album covers, underground comics and newspapers, and concert souvenirs. So this is considered the first psychedelic poster. The Amazing Charlatans, also known as the seed because of its genesis for a new style of concert posters. But it doesn't really scream psychedelic, does it? What it does do is it hints at what is to come. And this was for an event at the Red Dog Saloon in Virginia City, Nevada, which was a famous hippie hangout of its day and an early center for psychedelic experimentation. So the psychedelic movement had centers in numerous cities, including London, New York, Detroit, Vancouver, Portland, and Austin. But San Francisco was certainly the biggest and most impactful center. And it was the artwork of these 5 guys that became known as the San Francisco School of Poster Design. And from left to right, we see Alton Kelly, Victor Moscoso, Rick Griffin, Wes Wilson, and Stanley Mouse. 4 of the 5 had no formal training at all. Only this guy, Victor Moscoso, went to any art school. He was a student at the Cooper Union, then at Yale University, and as part of the youth movement to California, he comes out west and enrolls at classes at San Francisco Art Institute, where he eventually becomes an instructor. But it's this guy that I want to focus on this afternoon. This is Wes Wilson. He's considered the father of the psychedelic poster. He's the one who's doing it before his other 4 colleagues. And his early work is very distinctive. It's often all text, stuffed into shapes. Or the text forms shapes, or you get a combination of both. Now, I had the privilege to interview Wes Wilson before he passed away, and I asked him about his inspirations, and he was the one who said, I don't know exactly, but I was drawing from the past and the present, which made me wonder, his tumbling blocks, did he know about the geometric mosaic floor in Pompeii? Or how about the Egyptian motifs that he's using that Owen Jones in 1856 illustrates in his Grammar of Ornament? Or the close similarity of this Art Nouveau style that he incorporates in his 67 poster to what Will Bradley was doing more than 70 years earlier. Wilson's distinctive illegible lettering also echoes the typeface on this 1903 Vienna Secession poster. And it was designed by Alfred Roller, and to this day that typeface is known as Roller typeface. And then there's something closer to his time period, the op art that he was included, and how similar it is to what Bridget Riley and other op artists were doing in the 50s and 60s. So how was the magic done? Well, some of these posters had very short, small production runs, less than 500, and they could have been done silkscreen, but the vast majority were done using offset lithography, and the print runs would go anywhere from 500 to 5,000 posters per job. And it's called offset lithography because the printing plate never actually touches the paper. An inked image on the metal plate offsets onto rubber plate, which then prints onto paper. This was the main method of commercial printing in the 20th century. So some of my favorite finds are not concert posters. And this is what I started to focus on after the three major collections came in. What were the other artists, or what were the artists doing other than concert posters? Ballyho Fashions was a boutique in San Francisco that also sold concert tickets. And Joyful Alternative is about a peace and poet dance. Open Up and See was an advertising poster for new offices for the international advertising firm J. Walter Thompson. And then we also see an exhibition of psychedelic posters in Berkeley in 1967. Even iLab got into the act, the International League of Antiquarian Booksellers, because in 1967, they held a conference in San Francisco, and they commissioned this design. And then the first annual North Beach Photographic Art Fair, I thought was interesting that they didn't do something that kind of had a beat image, but instead went with something more psychedelic. So to wrap all this up, I just want to explain one of two reasons why I'm building this collection and why it is at the Huntington. The obvious is the design and the social history. It's a key part of the continuum of graphic design from the 19th to the 20th century, and it reflects an era that produced some of the most significant cultural changes of the 20th century. And as many of you have witnessed, it continues to influence visual culture, from fashion and fine art to advertising, interior design, and decorative arts. And I mentioned earlier how it influenced concert souvenirs in these pinback buttons, and also underground comics that comes out in the 70s, at least for these two, the Freak Brothers and Tales from the Tube. But another important reason as to why we're doing this at the Huntington is it reflects California history. Psychedelic era is forever tied to California and the West. It has this lasting impact on California visual culture. It's hard to think of the psychedelic movement without thinking of California and psychedelic posters. And it also creates this indelible impact on the American popular imagination of California. Tropes like the California lifestyle, California hippie, California liberalism, and California as a land of sunshine and opportunity. And for my last slide, I just want to share this as an inspiration for my title, Better Living Through Chemistry. And this was a Haight-Ashbury tourist poster. And we know it's a tourist poster because anybody living in the Haight would not be caught dead with this. But the idea was based on DuPont Corporation's advertising slogan, Better Things for Better Living Through Chemistry, which was an advertising program that they adopted in 1935. Thank you. Lucy Van Pelt is very quotable, by the way.
Hi, David. That
Hey.
was great. I think of graffiti and graffiti lettering, and I'm wondering if you've ever found any kind of documented link between the kind of lettering that was happening on those posters and the sort of thing that you see on the side of railroad cars and buildings and
Yeah, it's a great thought. I haven't had an opportunity to make that connection, but would love to do it. I think we do visually see something that reflects this illegible life, or this illegible lettering that Wilson and others was doing. And there's an interesting story about when Wilson created his illegible lettering. When he shows it to his client, Bill Graham, Graham looks at it and he says, "My God, that's not going to work. I can't read it." And Wes Wilson supposedly replied by saying, "And that's why people are going to stop and look at it." Now, I asked Wes during the interview, "Is this something you said?" And he said, "Oh, it sounds like something I'd say." So thank you. I was concerned we wouldn't have time for questions, because this is typically about a 45-minute to an hour course that I teach. And I try to include some dense slides so that my students can just photograph the slides.
You did that really well, and no hesitancy, great projections and everything. We're from California, from that period, and California's complicated. And where we lived, it was a surf culture, and it was still bright, and the colors are all the same, but it's very different. How do you relate the Southern California's visual changes to the Bay Area's weirdness?
Well, the weirdness was also in Southern California, because there was a psychedelic movement down there. But when we also think of the surf culture, that's a counterculture of its own. But that happens about 5 to 10 years earlier than the psychedelic movement. It starts in like 1957 with some of the first surf films. So in essence, you know, when you study counterculture in California, this is one of the reasons I wanted to build the surf culture collection as well, because it's the precursor to the psychedelic movement. But there was a psychedelic movement in Los Angeles, for sure. In fact, a good friend of mine was an artist for concerts in Los Angeles, and he created light shows. One of his best friends was Rick Griffin, one of the big five that I showed in that San Francisco school photo. So I don't know if that answers your question in terms of my opinion of it. But I certainly think of San Francisco in this time period being psychedelic purely, but Los Angeles is transitioning from surf counterculture to a little bit of psychedelic also.
I can see you doing parallel show with parallel pieces.
That could be my next course. Thank you.
David, thank you. That was truly wonderful. You talked a little bit about some of the artistic antecedents to the psychedelic imagery, and I was wondering, one of the earlier pieces you showed I think it was the fading of colors from one to another, which is something that you do, of course, see in the 19th century, and that has always looked to me very psychedelic. And to be quite candid, like images like the secessionist image, sometimes you see something, you think, this looks so modern, and it must be because somebody more recently picked up that imagery. Did you talk with Wes or anybody else about whether they were aware of any of those really early graphic formats, or was, maybe that was just a rediscovery?
Yeah, unfortunately, I did not have a chance to ask Wes about that, but I mean, we do know that in the 19th century, there was a printing process that developed called split fountain printing, where basically you could get that transitioning of colors. And the whole idea was you could fill the ink bed at the top of your press with a rainbow of colors. You didn't have to mix it up there. It would essentially mix itself as it was sliding down and being printed. And the beauty of that was you could never really get an exact copy. So in most cases, especially with 60s posters that show that transition of color, they're all a little different.
Kind of carrying on from that question, who ID'd the fact that that Grateful Dead poster came from the Rubaiyat, or was that always sort of known, or like who was the first person to clock that?
Yeah, I'd love to nail that information. It's just something that has sort of been passed on with information about the psychedelic posters, but there's no reference to anybody saying, I know this happened.
Yeah, there's another idea for your next exhibit
yeah,
of
for
like
sure.
the primary source next to the psychedelic interpretation.
Absolutely. Dave?
We got one back here first.
David, do you ever listen to music while you're sorting your posters and cataloging, and if so, what?
Well, I'm fortunate to have catalogers who can do the sorting, but it's also unfortunate that I'm not handling them as much as I would have liked. But along those lines, I have a quirky hobby where I actually listen to music every day, and I listen to it according to the artist's birthdays. So I have this very detailed calendar of all the music in my collection and the birthdays of the artists. So I get to hear the whole range of music that I have but the weird thing about that is sometimes you wake up listening to Leadbelly, and other times it's Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, there's so many connections. I was just taken with that wipe of colors, the fading, and I was thinking of Loie Fuller's Serpentine Dance, and also the postcards that pictured those kinds of dances with fading colors in the fantasy type postcards. That whole area of have you looked at that as kind of a topic for collection or investigation?
I have. Like with any collection, you need to put parameters on it. At least we do. We're looking at space and saying, do we have enough to make a point? Do we have enough for a researcher to use this collection and draw some interesting conclusions? But then it also comes down to space. the final frontier.
I'm hearing a topic for a conference here.
Yeah, yeah.
When, just because you can doesn't mean you should, yeah.
Yep, exactly. Always have to put parameters on what one collects.
Yeah.
It's a good thing for collectors to remember. Right, Nancy?
Thank you for such a lovely presentation. I was wondering if you saw kind of the psychedelic era in this early 60s period as laying kind of the foundation and groundwork for the Black Panthers and a lot of like the underground zines and posters of the Black Power movement that came, I think, around in 68. And I think they were in Oakland, so I have to imagine there was maybe some cross-pollination.
Yeah, I'm sure there are definite connections. I think that's going to be another chapter to take it. But the artists who were working for the Black Panthers were just as talented as this group, if not more. They may not have had the promoters to back them the way Wes Wilson and others had in terms of Bill Graham and Chet Helms, but they certainly made a graphic impact. So it's a great idea for more research.
Always more active.
Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering if someone might be curious about Albert Hoffman and why it took him 6 years to discover the hallucinogenic effects of LSD. Yeah. That could have been. Not that I'm aware of. Different time period. But he's working for a Swiss pharmaceutical company, and his project is actually to develop a circulatory and respiratory stimulant. And he's creating various compounds, and only when he comes up with whatever number compound LSD is, and I think it's in the 20s, this is when he accidentally absorbs it and he experiences these hallucinogenic properties. So the company shifts gears.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I love the way that you are really drawing the connections between all of these different pre-existing artistic styles. I wondered if you'd also connected it to the rising American Indian movement. I noticed, you see words like powwow, you see drugs that are derived from indigenous cultures or attributed to indigenous cultures. But is that a theme that you have explored or are interested in exploring as another one of those visual influences?
Yeah, thank you. I'm starting to explore that, starting to scratch the surface of that with one of my colleagues who's our curator of Western history. And we're looking at the American Indian influence, the indigenous Americans on this. And in one area in particular, you definitely mentioned the Powwow Association, but also the iconic image that Family Dog Production uses is actually a Native American in a top hat. And it's supposed to be a recognizable photograph, and we're trying to hunt down the source of that photo for which it inspired his design.
Dave, we've come to understand a little bit that, we understand that very often an artist who is given the assignment on a Friday, having to have everything done by the following Monday to have the concert ahead of time. When you talked to Wes, did you talk about the time that it took to actually come up with the design, go through the printing process, and have it out the door?
We had a loose conversation about that, for sure, and he was basically saying his deadlines were super tight, and a week would have been generous. So from original art to the actual poster, because Bill Graham wasn't exactly sure who he was booking right up until the end, and there could have been last-minute changes, these artists were working on very tight deadlines. And of course, the printing press was the tail of the dog. So they had to make up for any lost time. if the artist was submitting some artwork a little late. So in essence, they're kind of like the real heroes to make sure that these posters were produced on time in a really short time period. And the litho firms, the printing firms themselves, were pretty small. We're talking about 4 or 5 people per firm. And there was about a half a dozen or so that were extremely active in San Francisco and the East Bay at this time. So they were busy.
David, a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
If you're saying that sometimes, are you saying that sometimes the artist is doing his artwork not knowing exactly who the performers were? I mean, some of these posters have become so iconic for specific performers, but they could have become related to some other performer in that situation, you know, if they change venue, or not venues, but performers.
It's certainly possible. I'd love to find some of the original art or some of the original sketches that did not become a poster. My friend who worked with Rick Griffin is sitting on a cache of these somewhere, and I hope to be able to take a look at those at some point, but they're buried in his warehouse. But that would be just a fascinating aspect of this whole design process, is how many permutations did a poster go through before it finally ended up looking like we see it as.